Hello everyone, this is Dr. Evans, and today I'm going to be talking about teaching controversial issues and specifically focusing on some of the legal things that you need to know as a future educator. So in preparation for this, you should have already watched the documentary, The Revisionaries, which discusses the process in which the curriculum is created, specifically in Texas. They talk a lot in this documentary about the inclusion of evolution in the curriculum, but then also talk about different variations like intelligent design. We also see some other topics being addressed across the social studies and English language arts area in this documentary. One of the reasons that I like to show this documentary is I think it kind of provides a window into the process in which curriculum is made. So contrary to popular belief, curriculum is not just generated by teachers or by content experts in a particular field or by the people who make textbooks or make the online modules and resources that are available to schools. It's actually a byproduct of a pretty intensive public process that includes some of these actors, but then also includes members of the public. And as you see in the video, the boards of education, both local and state, also can play a pretty significant role. And so we don't end up in the classroom having necessarily the things that the top experts in a field might choose. And it's just important to be knowledgeable that there are other influences that are coming into play in terms of the curriculum making process. Another stakeholder, this doesn't really get discussed as much in the documentary, but I'll talk about it in a moment, is business and industry. They also will be seen lobbying frequently inside of into these state boards of education, talking about what should or should not be included in the curriculum. So why is it? Why is it that people fight so vociferously over the curriculum? Well, part of the explanation is that each state has its own compulsory attendance statute, meaning that students in the United States or children in the United States are required to go to school. Now, this varies from state to state, whether or not the age is 14 or 16 or what have you. But the state does have the right to compel attendance, meaning that parents and communities care a lot about what goes on in the school since their kids are required to be there. Now, of course, you do have the option. You could opt out and go to a parochial school or go to a private school. But for many taxpayers, they feel that they're already paying this tax money. They want their kids to go and get their free public education, but then they also want some control over what they're going to be taught in the curriculum. They know that essentially you're talking about working with a student population that's a captive audience, right? So this means that the curriculum becomes really important in terms of what the students are exposed to. And so beyond some of the social issues that we learn about in the documentary, we see that there are a number of other people with different interests who are going to want to make sure that the curriculum portrays certain interests in a particular way. A recent example in 2012 in California came about when we see the introduction of a high school environmental science class. In this class, they created a curriculum where they talked quite a bit, as you might imagine, about waste and recycling and the impact of industry on the environment. So millions of dollars were spent by an organization called the American Chemistry Council. That is kind of a fancy name, but it basically represents oil and petroleum interests. And they were concerned about the portrayal of plastic shopping bags as it appeared in the curriculum. So in the curriculum that the state of California came up with, they talked about how these plastic shopping bags were a major source of waste, and that they take hundreds of years to break down in landfills. And so they raise a lot of those different types of concerns. Here we have the American Chemistry Council coming in, and they're advocating and spending millions of dollars to have a little text box placed into the curriculum that highlights the benefits of plastic shopping bags. So in this case, they talk about that the plastic grocery bags are more energy efficient because they require 70% less energy to manufacture. Or this was always surprising to me. Learning about the shipping. So plastic bags weigh less than paper bags. And so then they argue that when you put these on a truck for transport, that the fuel, that you would use less fuel transporting plastic bags, which in turn would be better for the environment. So you can see that they're arguing pretty hard that there are some positives about plastic shopping bags because they are representing the manufacturers of these plastic shopping bags, right? So we oftentimes see industry also trying to play a role in terms of shaping what is going on in the curriculum. Now, just so you know that this did get placed into the curriculum, but then after some protests, this was actually stripped out of the curriculum, and so it's this ongoing process over time. Now, the focus of our conversation today is talking about controversial curriculum. This is a slide that I got that has things that were controversial, and was generated in like the 1990s. So you can see this list of many of the different controversial topics that are sometimes considered as being talked about in a public school classroom. And the reason I want to show you the 1990 version is because I think it highlights that these are ongoing conversations. So some things continue to be controversial today. So when we see things like gun control up there, when we see things like abortion, we know that these continue to be contentious conversations over time and in schools. But I also want you to notice that there's some other things up here that don't really rise to the level of controversy anymore, or at least certainly not to the same extent that they would make a list if we were talking about it today. So things like the role of women in the military, or things like driving under the influence, these things are not really major concerns today. And so it's important to understand that when we're thinking about controversy, that these are often reflective of what's going on in society at large. Now, it's not up here on this slide, but another one that I was thinking about when I was preparing this is that seatbelts, like the mandate that you have to wear a seatbelt in your car. Well, in the early 1980s, 60% of the population felt that this should not be a law and that you should not be required to like wear a seatbelt, right? So you'd be hard pressed to find it's probably like 90% plus are in support of seatbelt laws now in 2020 in the 2020s. So it's just important to understand that these things are oftentimes contextual and they do change over time. So what you might care most about is, what do teachers need to know when they are teaching these controversial issues, or when they're trying to address some of these things that might be controversial in their community? So let's start with a discussion of academic freedom, in particular for K-12 educators. So I'm going to cite a Supreme Court case, Tinker Des Moines, and you see here that they write that students and teachers do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. So this means that students and teachers, you do have your constitutional rights. However, it is not the same as being out in public because you are inside of an educational institution. So yes, you do have constitutional rights. Yes, you do have right to free speech, but there can be limits that are placed on this free speech because it has to be executed in a way that it does not interfere with the school's educational mission. So this is, a teacher could not stand up and give a political speech about their own personal political beliefs in a classroom in the same way they could go to the local public park and they could stand up on a soapbox and share all of their political beliefs. These are two different contexts. And the important thing to know is that what they're focused on is that the school has an educational mission to educate their children. And so anything that is seen as interfering with this or as a distraction to this can be stifled. So, for many students, you'd probably be familiar with the dress code policies, and we could definitely go down, a rabbit hole with this. But that's oftentimes why you see rules in schools about not being able to wear shirts, for example, with vulgar messages on it. So certainly you see lots of people walking around in public and they can have pretty obscene things written on a t-shirt, and there's nothing we can do about it because of the right to free speech. But in schools, somebody coming in and wearing a vulgar t-shirt, that would be a distraction to the other students or to the teachers in the school itself. And so this is where the school has a right to limit what that teacher or what that student wears to school because of this. Now, I fully acknowledge that dress codes, in terms of like what constitutes a distraction, in particular, as it impacts women, that is a different conversation. I'm just pointing out that the law does allow for some restrictions to be placed here. I want to focus specifically in on curriculum. So it's important to know that public school teachers, you do not have the right as a public school teacher to determine the content of the instructional program. This is set by the school board. This is set by district and state policies. So a public school teacher cannot do whatever they want in the classroom as it relates to curriculum content. And if you want to think of this as an extreme, I came up with kind of an extreme example, like a second grade teacher can't simply decide that they don't want to teach addition. Like, I don't care for math, I'm not going to teach it. That can't happen in a classroom. And so what the courts have decided is that the school district has a legitimate interest in regulating the curriculum because we understand that there are certain things that we want to make sure that all of our students are exposed to and that they learn. And so an individual teacher can't just go off and change that curriculum that's been agreed to by the community. Now, the good news is that if you are teaching things that are approved by the district, if you're using the prescribed curriculum, then as a teacher, you are not legally vulnerable if somebody becomes upset with you for teaching something that's been approved by the school district. And even if something's been approved by the district, then your building principal or your superiors, they might be pressured that you can't use some materials, but unless they give you proper notice and they go through a process, you're actually fine to use these books and videos if they've already been approved by the district. So this happened a few years ago when I first got here in Talawanda, which is the school district that serves Miami University. An English teacher was using the movie American Beauty in an English language arts class. This became pretty controversial because there was a lot of adult content in this film. But in that particular case, this film was already on the approved list for the district, and so the teacher was fine in terms of using that particular video. So just important to understand, as long as you are consistent with what has been approved in the curriculum, then legally, somebody's not going to be coming after the teachers in terms of trying to sue you or something like that. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of parental rights. What we know is that districts and schools, it's been affirmed over and over again that they can create a curriculum and that they can teach this curriculum. They have broad discretion to do it, even if there might be community or parental objections to some of these curricular decisions. And so we see a number of different court cases, and I try to span across the years because I thought some of these were just kind of interesting. So we see that first one all the way back in 1886, but you can see that the state, the courts held up that a requirement for students to attend music classes over parental objections. The schools won. Up to 1995, the state or the courts upheld a school requirement that students had to attend an AIDS education assembly. In 2008, we see that being upheld the use of a book in primary grades that portrayed diverse families, including a gay marriage, over a parental claim that they should have the opportunity to opt their child out. So again and again, we're seeing the courts backing up schools that they are permitted to have like requirements within their school system. And then finally in 2016 is just kind of, I thought this was interesting because it was different. As a Spanish class assignment, the students were required to memorize and recite the Mexican Pledge of Allegiance and then sing the Mexican national anthem in a unit on Mexico. This is just purely a language exercise. And again, this classroom assignment was upheld in the courts as being appropriate. Now, just because something is appropriate doesn't mean that it's not going to be controversial. Of course, many of these things would be controversial. And so what many districts choose to do is they do make provisions for parents to opt students out of a given activity or unit. So even though they could compel parents and children to be exposed to certain curriculum things, that really they do have to make a choice in terms of like, do they want to create a district has to make a choice in terms of whether they want to create an opt-out option. Now, this is very frequent in many school districts, in particular in high school and English or middle school classes, where they will present parents with the books that are in the reading program and provide them an opportunity to say if they don't want their child to read a particular book, they can choose a different option. So many schools have like an opt-out option for something along these lines. Now, we also see the emergence of a lot of paperwork now regarding these classroom libraries where, by and large, students are just allowed to pick whatever they want, like out of the library. But increasingly, we're seeing paperwork where they're asking parents, like, is it okay? Can the student read anything that they want in the classroom library? And created an option for some parents to say that there are certain materials that they don't want their students exposed to, and then those students are not allowed to check out those particular books. Typically, teachers are not going to be forced to discontinue instructionally relevant activities just because a parent is unhappy with something. So this isn't just the content, but then how do you go about teaching it? And then I always like to include this one because I just think it's kind of a cute and interesting example. You see here the pictures of the little rocks here. There's a court case that involved a third grade teacher, and essentially the students made pet rocks, and then they had to write stories about the adventures of their pet rocks. You know, it's just kind of a cute, like, little ECE activity. But what was interesting is one of the parents got very upset about this particular exercise because they felt that it was demonic, that you were giving human characteristics to inanimate objects, and so they had some religious objections, and so they went after the school about this particular pedagogical approach. But again, in this case, the teacher was totally fine because it was seen as, this is just a creative writing exercise. This is consistent with what goes on in classrooms across the country. And so if you're doing things that are widely recognized in your field as being appropriate pedagogically, then you will be just fine as a teacher. Now, in terms of if you know that you're going to be teaching something that is controversial, there are a couple of tips that I wanted to share with you. One is to be self-reflective, thinking about why you're teaching a particular topic, and if it's applicable, then what might be your biases on this topic. Making sure that you're working hard to create a safe environment for your students so that they feel comfortable if some conversations come up. In terms of it's something being developmentally appropriate, making sure that you're starting with where the students are on a topic. It's probably a good idea not to assume too much knowledge on a particular topic, and so to make sure that you have a good sense of what information the students already have. Making sure that you are responsive to your students' values and feelings, creating opportunities for discussion when appropriate, and perhaps most importantly, being prepared with a rationale. As an educator, you should be ready to defend your pedagogical decisions. If you're teaching evolution, like thinking about the documentary, for example, if you're that high school science teacher, you should be able to defend like why this is an important part of the biology curriculum. Quite frankly, that one is a pretty easy example, or very defensible. Other things to consider. Well, you want to make sure that if you're going to be talking about controversial things in the classroom, that you do it very well. And so you want to make sure that something is like really educational, valuable. And just to go back for one moment, in terms of thinking about like that opt-out opportunity, if you're teaching characterization in your third grade classroom, and you're using the book Harry Potter, and some parents are upset because they think Harry Potter promotes witchcraft, and so they're upset that the class is reading Harry Potter. Well, you're trying to teach characterization, so that's probably like not a battle that's worth fighting. Your students can read Harry Potter to do characterization, but for the parents who have concerns about that book, you can come up with a different book that also allows you to talk about characterization that would work for that other student. So even though you don't think you might not think it's like a big deal, it's probably like not worth the fight, especially since what you're actually trying to communicate doesn't really have anything specifically to do with Harry Potter, with wizardry and witchcraft. There's other ways that you could get at that particular topic. We talked about this a little bit already. Appropriateness, considering the maturity level of your learners. Making sure that the information is relevant. I think this one is really important. The information that's available. Is the information in relevant materials, are they up to date? Do you know that they come from good sources? Making sure to really double check on this. Thinking about the reliability of the information that you're sharing, and just making sure also that, you probably don't want to have like a 10-minute conversation about abortion, right? Like, don't open up a topic that obviously is going to require a lot of in-depth conversation. You don't want to give short shrift to something like that. And then, again, I'm just reiterating that teachers should be able to articulate their rationale for teaching a particular topic. And there's lots of great templates online if you think you might be teaching something that's controversial, on how you can prepare a teacher rationale, and there should be some samples in Canvas as well. Finally, so prior to a lot of the controversies that we've been seeing around the country, every district has already had almost every district already has like some policy embedded about teaching controversial issues. So it's kind of interesting to see some of these fights, is that districts have long had these policies in place that talks about that sometimes it's important to talk about controversial issues in the classroom. And what they are already telling teachers, and so it's important for you to become familiar with the policies of your particular district, is there's already a lot of guidelines. And so they talk about the instructor needing to be objective, needing to discuss all sides of different controversial issues, providing fair opportunity for students to study, consider, and discuss these different issues. Guidelines for like functioning within the limits of good taste. Now, obviously, some of these things can be open for interpretation, but we hear some of these things about like how do we teach about slavery? Like, do we have to provide all sides? Well, historically, that's not been the case. That seems just silly and frankly like idiotic that we would have to spend too much time focusing on the beliefs of the Confederacy, right? So I don't think that these policies were intended to try to really focus on like having 50% of the conversation has to be on this side, 50% has to be on this side. I think more of the emphasis is placed on this idea that the teacher should be trying to just provide all the different information that is out there, but that's within reason. It's within reason. And so some of these conversations, quite frankly, are becoming a little bit silly there. I want to highlight something as well. This I got the little hand pointing down there. It shall be the responsibility of the instructor to refrain from advocating partisan causes, sectarian religious views, or selfish propaganda of any kind through any classroom or school device. However, an instructor shall not be prohibited from expressing a personal opinion as long as the student is encouraged to reach his or her own decision independently. So again, this is just a specific school district. You need to look at your own district's policy, but I think that this is a fairly common clause that you'll find in a lot of these policies. And I think this one is interesting because you are allowed to express your personal opinion to your students. What you're not allowed to do is try to compel them to believe a particular thing, and you're not allowed to advocate a particular cause, right? And so one of the things that's been interesting is there's been a number of more recent court cases talking about the different things that you can display in your classroom. And so recently some districts have passed rules asking that that teachers not display pride flags, or they're not to display the Black Lives Matter flags in their classroom. And so some of these things have been shot down in the courts because they're so specific that they single out that you're only not allowed to show the pride flag, or you're only not allowed to show the BLM flag. Now, that is also making a political case from the public school perspective. And so frequently those things have been struck down. However, if we see policies that say that you're not allowed to have a pride flag, a BLM flag, you're also not allowed to have a Tea Party flag up in your classroom. If you're just not allowed to have flags in general, well, then it's seen as though the district can come up with those types of policies as long as they're treating everybody equally, right? So that's an important distinction, and that's what we're seeing happen in the courts currently, is that they're trying to kind of work through some of these issues. But this is why it's so important to become familiar with the policies that exist in your district, because as long as you're following your district's policy, then by and large you're going to be safe from a legal vantage point in terms of your career as an educator. So I hope that this information is helpful for you. I hope that you feel confident that if you are teaching and you have a rationale for what you're teaching, and what you're teaching has been approved by the district and by the state, then you are in good shape as an educator and you shouldn't have too many concerns. All right, thank you.